So when Bungie first introduced this week's Grandmaster Nightfall, they said they wanted this to be the hardest strike ever made. They wanted people to cry and question how you're supposed to do it on Grandmaster difficulty. And when I saw this mentioned in the Vidoc, I was super excited for this one. As someone who does solo GMs and solo GM speedruns, I wanted to get mad at this strike. So is this the hardest GM ever made? Did I cry while running it? No, and nearly, actually. Destiny 2 Sandbox is in a state where I highly doubt anything Bungie ever makes will be the hardest X ever. A lot of people might argue that the Day 1 raid was the hardest Day 1 raid ever, and I will play devil's advocate and say, was it the hardest Day 1 raid, or was there an encounter with so little feedback that poses a brick wall for teams for 10 plus hours that it made it seem like it was the hardest Day 1 raid ever due to being completely exhausted when they reached the final boss? Last Wish, yeah, had 2 clears Day 1, Salvation's Edge only had 1, but Last Wish had 14 clears in the first 2 days. Do you know how many Salvation's Edge had in the first 2 days? Salvation's Edge had 689 clears in the first 2 days. Clearly, something was happening, and I can tell you it's called exhaustion. It's not called difficulty. When I think of the hardest GM ever, my mind immediately goes to the Mercury strikes that no longer exist, Tree of Probabilities, and a Garden World, which I would argue Tree of Probabilities was the harder one, the original Corrupted with all the Overload Sniper Hobgoblins, and the original Lightblade before the Resilience changes. Now, all 4 of these were before those Resilience changes, and 3 of them were before the Anti-Barrier changes, although realistically that was only 2 of them because the Anti-Barrier changes had no effect in the Corrupted. For anyone unaware, during the first 2 seasons of Grandmaster Nightfalls, barrier champions required an absurd amount of damage to break their shield, essentially forcing players to either run Ariana's Vow or completely focus each barrier together in a team. Nowadays, you can sneeze on a barrier on a GM with a pulse rifle and it breaks in half a second. Back then, it would take you about 4 seconds of continuous shooting to break a barrier shield. Back then as well, there was no overcharge modifier or any of that stuff for free 25% bonus damage. What made GMs difficult back then is that you needed to play as a team a lot more than now. You need to play your life a lot more than now, and you need to think about your loadout a lot more than now. Now, I'm not saying that you don't need to do any of these now, because you do, but you have a lot more leeway now. And with this leeway, there's never going to be a GM as hard as those old ones. Song of Flame 90% DR means I can just face tank whatever I want. Transcendence Consecration and Ergo Sum is just absolutely ridiculous, beating GMs in 5 minutes. Hunters can just one-shot barrier champions with Winter Shroud and Liar's Handshake. And if you don't even want to build into those ability-focused builds, you can get away with using whatever you want, and 99% of the time, you'll be fine. There's a video of a Liminality GM clear using Darcy, which is widely considered to be one of the worst exotic weapons in the game, and it has been for 4 years now, and they beat it in 11 minutes. I think the hardest GM we've ever received is that Tree of Probabilities. I distinctly remember this being the only GM I've ever done where I didn't get platinum rewards, and killing all the champions in the boss fight of that strike was just absolutely absurd, and you would have to be a masochist to even consider doing that. Now, don't get me wrong, I find this strike fun. I ran it solo first and enjoyed everything except for how fast the boss moves in Phase 3, which is what made me almost cry, is when I died with him at about 10% health on my 6th attempt. And then I ran it for a couple times in a team, and I actually quite enjoyed it. What I like the most is that there are actual changes from the Expert version to the Grandmaster version. The lava ascends and descends quicker, they introduced boops and Acolyte eyes in the side rooms, and I thought that was neat too, and I found the continuity of the Expedition Commander a neat addition too. It's definitely a fun GM, and I will say, compared to the other GMs so far this season, this is definitely the hardest GM this season, but hardest GM ever? Definitely not. Would I like for Bungie to make a hardest GM ever? Absolutely. It's just, with the amount of stuff we've got now, I never see that being the case. Something else that I've been wondering is, if this GM launched back in those old times, would it be the hardest GM ever? And I still think the answer is no. I still think Tree of Probabilities would take the cake. And the reason is the boss fight in Tree of Probabilities, I think, is a lot more chaotic than the boss fight in Liminality. The first two phases of the Liminality boss fight are very chill. The Tormentor moves so slowly, so slowly. And in the third phase, you can kind of just bait him around pillars. In Tree of Probabilities, you did not have that luxury. In the Tree of Probabilities boss room, that guy was on you, blasting you. There were barrier champions up top, absolutely annihilating you, and there were lasers everywhere. If you even looked at a laser, you would die. And I kind of feel bad because I feel like with this GM definitely being the hardest and the longest of the GMs so far this season, the only one that's going to maybe make it a bit more tolerable is we get Psyops Cosmodrome again. But I just don't see anyone choosing to ever run this GM unless they need whatever the weapon is the week of the GM. So right now it's the Slammer, and the Slammer is obviously a great weapon, especially if you did not farm for a Falling Guillotine during Onslaught. But Bungie's bringing back Brave Arsenal focusing in the first place, so like who really cares about the Slammer unless you need that Cold Steel roll? No one's farming this for Ascendant Shards. People are going to wait until Fallen Saber or the Disgraced, or we'll see how the new Exes crashes, Warren of Nothing, stuff like that. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you like and don't like about Liminality, and do you think Liminality is the hardest GM ever? Thanks for watching, and have a good one.